This is Dermatology Weekly by MDedge, where we bring you the latest in dermatology news, followed by peer-to-peer conversations about the latest in clinical dermatology and things interesting to dermatologists. I'm the voice of MDedge Podcasts, Nick Andrews. Coming up in the peer-to-peer portion of the show this week, Dr. Vincent DeLeo hosts a conversation about medical apps for your mobile phone and how they're being regulated. Dr. DeLeo welcomes Dr. Orit Markowitz and medical student Cynthia Chan to talk about the regulation and the three most popular medical apps. But before we get to peer-to-peer, of course, dermatology news. This week in the news, having conservative parameters with skin color is the key to maximizing cosmetic laser success, and our COVID-19 update. A vaccine advances to phase 3 testing. But our top story today, there is limited evidence that off-label non-selective beta blockers can be effective for facial erythema and flushing in rosacea. However, there is positive evidence supporting their use. This comes from a systematic review of 9 studies published in the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology. You can find a link to the study and the MDedge article in the show notes. Let's start with the review itself. The systematic review included a case control study of nearly 54,000 patients in an equal number of controls that evaluated beta blockers in general, but the remaining studies and case reports in the review only included 106 patients in total, the largest of which was a prospective cohort study of propranolol in 63 patients. There was also a study of 15 patients in a randomized clinical trial of nadolol that was published more than 3 decades ago. Now, for the patient population. The studies included patients with a history of failed therapies. Indeed, only a small number of beta blockers were evaluated. Outcomes reported in the studies varied widely, which ruled out doing a meta-analysis. Dr. Jade Lager of the Department of Dermatology at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands and her co-authors pointed out that erythema and flushing were assessed by using a wide spectrum of mostly subjective clinical patient-based score. They also said that method standardization was often missing. According to their review, most of the studies did show improved erythema and flushing after initiation of oral beta blockers. Dr. Diane Thibodeau is a professor of dermatology at Penn State University, which is in central Pennsylvania. She was not an author of the study. In an interview, she spoke with Dermatology Weekly and said that this study adds no new evidence to support the use of beta blockers and that, as the authors point out, the 9 studies reviewed were of low quality with a variety of outcome measures. That precluded the generation of a meta-analysis, which would have been new information. Dr. Thibodeau is the lead author of an update on the management options for rosacea that was published in the National Rosacea Society Expert Committee back in 2019. That update pointed out that beta blockers are among the drugs that are sometimes prescribed off-label to help rosacea-associated flushing, along with nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, antihistamines, and clonidine. Dr. Lager, who wrote the systematic review, wrote that beta blockers come with risks and can aggravate asthma and psoriasis and are contraindicated in patients with heart failure, cardiogenic shock, and other cardiovascular diseases, along with hyperactive airway and Raynaud's disease. They also wrote that carvedilol and propranolol have more antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties than other non-selective beta blockers that may curtail rosacea manifestations. Dr. Lager and her colleagues called for further research to assess the efficacy of beta blockers for patients with rosacea. And we move now to strategies for cosmetic laser procedures. Cosmetic laser procedures for darker skin types are associated with higher risks of pigmentary alterations and scarring, according to Dr. Andrew Alexis. But these procedures can be performed safely with special considerations. Dr. Alexis is the chair of the Department of Dermatology at Mount Sinai Morningside and Mount Sinai West in New York. He spoke at the Masters of Aesthetics Symposium, which was held virtually, of course. According to data from 2018 in the American Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgery, 30% of all aesthetic procedures in the U.S. are being performed on self-identified non-white racial ethnic groups. This is projected to continue to increase given demographic changes as well as changes in our technologies and approaches to aesthetic procedures that allow for safer outcomes across a more diverse patient range. He offered the following advice. 1. Know your device. 2. Know your patient. And 3. Recognize the differences in preferred treatment options and parameters. Okay, so first, know your device. Dr. Alexis suggested that you should understand the range of parameters that are safe and effective for a given skin type in your clinic. And don't just rely on what manufacturers provide in the manual, because you could have safe parameters as directed by the manual, but you could also undertreat some patients because the settings are a bit too conservative. However, Dr. Alexis also said that there might be a situation where following recommended settings for a specific skin type might still wind up with a complication. Doing test spots is key in order to master the device that you are using. Okay, know your patient. Dr. Alexis said that you shouldn't assume that you know a patient's skin phototype ancestry when that person first presents. When you do that, you can arrive at erroneous conclusions with respect to phototype and with respect to ancestral background. He said you should treat your patient as an individual with no cookie-cutter responses and no assumptions. He also emphasized that you should ask patients about their ancestry and about how their skin responds to sunlight in terms of tanning ability and to injury, to inflammations and insect bites, acne, and other minor abrasions. Okay, recognize the differences in treatment preference and parameters. Often, according to Dr. Alexis, less is more. As an example, he said that with laser hair removal, strive for longer wavelengths, lower influences, longer pulse durations, and increased epidermal culling. A study from 2002 in the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology showed that the maximum tolerated influence of type 6 skin with the 1064 YAG laser was 50 joules per centimeter squared. You can read more about Dr. Alexis' thoughts on this topic by clicking the link in the show notes. And finally today, our weekly COVID-19 update. Johnson & Johnson announced that their COVID-19 vaccine is advancing to phase 3 testing earlier this week. The vaccine uses the same technology as an Ebola vaccine that's already been approved by European regulators. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is aiding Johnson & Johnson with development, described this in a news release as the fourth phase 3 clinical trial evaluating an investigational vaccine for this coronavirus disease. The NIAID tally tracks products likely to be presented soon for the FDA approval. The World Health Organization's COVID vaccine tracker lists 9 candidates as having reached this stage, including products that were developed in Russia and China. As many as 60,000 volunteers will be enrolled in the trial, with about 215 clinical research sites expected to participate. The vaccine will be tested in the U.S. and abroad. The start of the test is known as the Ensemble trial or the Ensemble trial, depending on your pronunciation. It follows positive results from a phase 1/2A clinical study, which involved a single vaccine. The results of this study have been submitted and are set to be published online very shortly. Johnson & Johnson is an American company based in New Jersey. The company noted that they intend to offer the vaccine on a not-for-profit emergency pandemic use. They also released the study protocol for its phase 3 test. The developers of the other late-stage COVID vaccine candidates also have done this. This was reported by Medscape Medical News. Because of the great interest in the COVID vaccine, the American Medical Association had last month asked the FDA to keep physicians informed of their COVID-19 vaccine review process. And that's it for this week in Dermatology News. When we come back, Dr. Vincent DeLeo hosts Peer to Peer. Welcome back to episode 83 of Dermatology Weekly. It's time now to welcome the host of Peer to Peer, Dr. Vincent DeLeo.
Today we're talking to Dr. Orit Markowitz and her colleague Cynthia Chan about regulation of dermatology-related apps. Can you both please introduce yourselves for our listeners?
Hi, I'm Dr. Orit Markowitz. I am an associate professor at Mount Sinai Medical Center. I have served as the director of pigmented lesions and skin cancer since 2007. I am currently the chair of the credentialing committee for the advanced imaging group, or basically the cutaneous imaging group for the American Academy of Dermatology. And I have the privilege of having Dr. Cynthia Chan work with me last year as an imaging fellow. Cynthia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia. I'm a fourth-year medical student at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. I'm excited to be here with you all.
Okay, great. So let's get started. In your great article, you review the top 3 most prevalent dermatology-related apps used by dermatology residents. Can you explain to us how this ranking was determined and what those apps are?
First, we created a survey looking at mobile app usage, and then partnered with the AAD to distribute that survey to all dermatology residents in the United States. Among the hundreds of residents who responded regarding which dermatology-related apps they were using, the most prevalent, in descending order, were Visual DX, UpToDate, and Mohs surgery appropriate use criteria. A more comprehensive discussion of survey results will be published separately from our article today.
So you talk about the 3 most prevalent apps used by residents. The Visual DX and the UpToDate are general, and then the Mohs surgery appropriate use criteria apps. So let's focus on the 2 general ones. Can you weigh the pros and cons of those 2 for us?
Sure. So, the article scope was really to look at utility of apps in the dermatology space among U.S. residents. We did ask the residents what were their top considerations when choosing an app, but we didn't extensively review within this particular study and survey the pros and cons of the particular apps. However, residents, when choosing apps, for example, the top considerations was whether the information was up to date and also whether the information was accurate. In these 3 types of apps, UpToDate does cite, have primary citations, and also I believe other than that, we could not really find other regulatory guidelines in terms of what would make these apps up to date or accurate.
Like Dr. Markowitz said, the scope wasn't necessarily to discuss the pros and cons of the apps. However, the article does describe sort of the logistics of the app, what content, the pricing, etc. And UpToDate is the only app with substantial peer-reviewed publications showing a positive effect on clinical outcomes.
Yes, I thought that was very interesting. In your article, you did look somewhat at the quality, of the information in terms of peer review and citing references. And you also get into the regulation of these apps and others. Can you talk a little about the regulations that are in place now for apps such as these?
So our article tried to simplify and summarize the current regulation of mobile medical apps. There are 3 primary government agencies responsible for regulating mobile medical apps. They are the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and Office for Civil Rights. So the FDA is the main regulatory body. It only regulates mobile medical apps that meet the definition of medical device set forth by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This means apps, quote, intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or, continue quote, intended to affect the structure or any function of the body, end quote. So this definition may seem broad, but the FDA regulates these mobile medical apps only if they are considered to pose more than minimal risk. So for example, mobile medical apps that are designed only to provide easy access to information related to health conditions they're considered minimal risk, and they do not require pre-market review or registration with the FDA. It's important to keep in mind that mobile medical apps that are initially minimal risk could add new software, such as artificial intelligence, which may have more risk for users. In 2019, the FDA began piloting a pre-certification program that grants long-term approval to organizations that develop apps instead of reviewing each app product individually. I'll also briefly explain the role of the FTC and Office for Civil Rights. For mobile medical apps that are already in use, the FTC only becomes involved in response to deceptive or unfair acts or practices relating to privacy, data security, and false or misleading claims about safety or performance. And then the Office for Civil Rights enforces HIPAA when relevant to these apps.
I would like to add to that, that basically when we're utilizing textbooks, for example, and we're looking at images, it's going to help in our ability to sort of diagnose and manage patients. So essentially, what I think is, if we're kind of translating what the FDA is stating, is if we're using it within that space, if we're utilizing these apps, for example, with residents who are essentially using Visual DX, if they're using it simply as a resource to look at images and try to understand slightly better their diagnostic criteria for managing patients, one could argue that that's, within a non-medical device. It's when they're relying on these apps in terms of what they're truly diagnosing and managing, more so than, for example, a clinician in person. That's where we start to cross the line in terms of whether the definition is in fact crossing into a medical device and requires regulation if patient outcome is being impacted by these apps, or as Cynthia mentioned, if these apps are utilizing additional technology to try to better efficiency and productivity of the user. Then you're crossing into medical devices.
I think that's a very clear discussion of a very complex issue. Can you tell us, with the 3 apps that you bring up in your article, where are the regulations with those specific apps?
So essentially, there is no regulatory with these apps. Partially, as Cynthia had mentioned, because by definition, if they're just being utilized as a reference and not as a, this is what I'm going to use to help my diagnosis or management of a patient, then they're not under the definition of a medical device. I do, our survey and further studies that we're initiating is to really get even a more granular understanding of whether perhaps there is more utility within these apps than we're aware of, and then it becomes the responsibility of us as professionals, myself as someone who has a real interest in credentialing and serves as a chair of credentialing within, advanced technologies connected with the American Academy of Dermatology and an educator. We have to start figuring out where they sort of place within our programs as we're educating residents. I think at the moment it's a bit more new, and so we are prioritizing the innovation, and we don't really have guidelines that are strictly in place yet, as far as I know, for regulation. Cynthia, remind me, had we seen anything else in terms of regulatory for these apps?
For the government side of things, the 3 agencies that we just talked about are the main players. There's some regulation in the private space. So for example, different app stores will have their own policies that try to mitigate risk for consumers. This private sphere does not have sort of the ability of the government really to enforce public safety and health.
You know, this is really a very important area for those of us who are educating residents in our specialty. And we really look forward to the studies that I'm assuming you guys are in the process of doing to get, as Dr. Markowitz pointed out, more granular in this area. So we really compliment you on this work and look forward to the future. For now, how can our residents, physicians in training, and even clinicians who are out of training become more diligent about the apps that they're using to get health information?
I think it's important that within training programs, we do kind of create the same way that we do have checkpoints and guidelines in terms of how we're educating residents, what criteria they have to meet. For example, let's say if they need to get certain number of surgeries done in their training and so forth, those are very well regulated within our academic educational space. I think that we do need to start moving in that direction in terms of at least explaining to the residents what is the current utility of apps. The same way that I've seen, for example, in my children who are in middle school, they're taught very early on how to appropriately reference when they're navigating online. And just to date myself, this is not something that was part of my educational background at their age because we didn't have online at that time. And so the same is going to go for apps. Like when you're explaining to them you can't use Wikipedia as a reference, it's the same education that we have to give the residents to say, if you're managing a patient, here are the appropriate modalities that we need you to use. This is something that you can use in addition to that to just help learn the information, for example, if you want to get a good score on your in-service. But in terms of managing a human being, we need to make sure that they have access to the people who are educating them, like a live clinician. We need to make sure that they're utilizing the textbooks that we've sort of recommended within that program, and that they understand where these particular technologies fall in terms of what's appropriate usage. And I think that that's a conversation that each program needs to start instilling within their training.
I think that's an excellent summary of this area as it relates to resident training, and a very, very important one. So I know this isn't part of your article, but are there any other apps that you'd sort of like to point to for residents?
You know, I think it's, I mean, certainly I think we have a lot of wonderful apps that are coming into play, and they are very helpful as tools for preparing for exams, trying to understand and navigating their education. But do I recommend a specific app to say, here's an app that you should use in terms of patient care or management? I would probably say that they shouldn't be utilizing those apps for that utility unless it's an app that is listed as a medical device and does have the proper regulatory behind it, which at the moment, I'm not as familiar with that app in the dermatology space. Cynthia, have you come across any apps that have those type of guidelines within the dermatology space?
All the apps that were included in the responses to the survey do not fall under FDA regulation. And so while I use apps and I know plenty of residents use apps, I'm hesitant to necessarily recommend a specific app. I think different apps have different utilities when used judiciously.
Actually, I think it's very important that both of you are not recommending anything, because that tells us where we are in terms of regulation of these apps, which is very important for the future. So I think this has been a great discussion, a very important area for the future. We look forward to the work that I know you guys are doing now. Anything else you'd like to add? And we'd like to really thank you for taking the time today to join us and to educate our listeners.
Thank you so much for having us, and we really appreciate the support and interest. And as myself, as well as an educator now for over a decade, I agree with you. I think this is one of the more important issues in terms of education that I'm starting to see more interest in, and I hope that others will also set forth some research and understanding, because I do think that while we have to be hesitant in incorporating these technologies, I also think the silver lining is that it's going to help us also come up with better ways to standardize our education and make things so much more accessible to residents and medical students. So I think there's also the very positive side, and we need to try to find a good way to embrace it and use it appropriately.
Yeah, I echo Dr. Markowitz's sentiments from the perspective of someone early in medical training myself. I enjoy using different modes of learning, and so it seems like a really exciting privilege to have a wide variety of resources available to dermatology residents, from like experienced attendings to beloved textbooks to novel software such as mobile medical devices. And like I said, I think it's important to be thoughtful when choosing resources. And I'm really grateful for this enlightening opportunity to look into the legislation and regulation of apps.
Beautiful summary. So again, we'd like to thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to your future work in this area. Have a good day.
Thank you.
And that's it for episode 83 of Dermatology Weekly. Derm Weekly is produced by MDedge editors Melissa Sears and Elizabeth Meshkati. The news portion of the show is written and produced by myself and Elizabeth Meshkati. Peer-to-Peer is produced by Melissa Sears. All MDedge podcasts are produced by executive editor Kathy Skarbek and the senior vice president for Medscape, Dr. Ivan Aransky.